The cardiac monitor in the private ICU wing of Caruso Tower had been beeping the same slow, agonizing rhythm for 11 days. 63 beats per minute. Too slow for a 7-year-old boy who should have been running through Central Park, throwing bread at pigeons, demanding ice cream at 11 in the morning. Instead, little Theo Caruso lay completely still against the white hospital sheets, his small chest rising and falling with the mechanical assistance of oxygen tubes taped across his pale face. Every specialist Vincent Caruso had flown in, from Johns Hopkins, from the Mayo Clinic, from a private pediatric institute in Zurich that didn't officially exist, had delivered the same devastating verdict in increasingly expensive language. The boy's immune system was attacking itself. His body was rejecting every treatment they tried. At this rate, he had maybe 3 weeks. Vincent Caruso was the kind of man who could reroute a city's water contracts with a single phone call, the kind of man whose name made senators go quiet at fundraisers. He had built the Caruso Group from a crumbling Brooklyn construction company into a $45 billion real estate and infrastructure empire. He had survived 2 assassination attempts, a federal investigation, and the particular cruelty of burying his wife in the same spring his son was born. He had never, in 51 years of living, encountered a problem he could not solve with either money or force. He was completely, utterly powerless. Lyra Voss had been a housekeeper at Caruso Tower for exactly 9 days when she first heard the boy cry. She was 26, and she moved through the 42nd floor of the residential wing like a woman trying not to be noticed, which was exactly what she was. The agency had placed her without a background check, because the woman who ran the agency owed a favor to Lyra's neighbor, and because Lyra had been desperate enough to take a job that paid under the table in a building with a reputation for silence. She wore the standard charcoal uniform, kept her dark hair pulled severely back, and scrubbed bathrooms with the focused energy of someone running out of options. She was running out of options. Her younger brother, Caleb, was 17 and facing a felony charge that wasn't entirely his fault. He had been in the wrong car with the wrong people on the wrong night in the Bronx, and the public defender assigned to his case had the enthusiasm of a man waiting for retirement. The private attorney, who could actually get Caleb out, was going to cost $12,000. Lyra had $240 in her checking account and a second job waitressing Tuesday through Thursday at a diner on Lexington that smelled permanently of burnt coffee and broken promises. She heard the boy at 2 a.m. on her 9th night, while she was restocking the linen closet at the end of the hall nearest the private medical suite the Caruso family maintained on the residential floor. It wasn't loud crying. It was worse than that. It was the thin, reedy, exhausted sound of a child who had been crying for so long that crying had become simply the texture of breathing. A sound for no one in particular, a sound that expected no response. Lyra stood in the hallway for a full 30 seconds. She was absolutely not supposed to be near the medical suite. Marcus, the head of security, had made that explicitly clear during her first hour in the building. The boys' floor was off limits to all domestic staff below senior level. There were cameras. There were guards. The consequences for unauthorized access were termination and, implied in the particular way Marcus smiled when he said it, something worse. Lyra walked toward the crying anyway. The door to the suite was cracked open 2 inches, the overnight nurse apparently having stepped away. Through the gap she could see the small shape in the bed, the tangle of monitoring equipment, the IV pole catching the dim light from the hallway. Theo had pushed himself up against the headboard, his legs tucked to his chest, his eyes wide open and completely unseeing. The flat, distant stare of a child trapped so deep inside his own fear that the room had ceased to exist. Lyra pushed the door open slowly. She sat on the edge of the chair nearest the bed, the one the overnight nurse used, and she said nothing. She simply sat there. After a moment, she reached out and covered the boy's small hand with hers. "I'm here," she said. That was all. It took 4 minutes. She counted them on the wall clock above the door. Theo's breathing gradually slowed. His eyes tracked over to her face, registered her as a person, as a presence, as someone who was not a doctor or a needle or another set of gloved hands approaching with something that would hurt. He looked at her the way children look at people who are not performing concern, with the specific, exhausted relief of someone who just needed another human being to be physically present in the same room. He fell asleep with her hand still covering his. Lyra sat there until the nurse came back, and then she left without saying anything, slipping back down the hallway the way she'd come. She thought that was the end of it. It wasn't. The next afternoon, one of the senior staff appeared at Lyra's side while she was waxing the corridor on 38, and informed her, without preamble or explanation, that she was being reassigned, effective immediately. She was to report to the 42nd floor medical suite, where she would serve as secondary overnight attendant to the boy. The regular nurse, a professional woman named Patricia, would handle all clinical tasks. Lyra would handle everything else. Presence, distraction, sitting in the chair. She was not told who had authorized this reassignment. She did not need to be told. Vincent Caruso had reviewed the security footage. She met him for the first time 3 days later. He came to the suite at 10 in the evening when Theo was sleeping, really sleeping, not the restless, terror-filled half-consciousness the medical staff had described as his typical nights. Lyra was sitting in the corner chair reading an old paperback she'd brought from home. She stood when he came in, because the energy in the room changed the moment he crossed the threshold, not in a frightening way, in the way of a weather system. You simply felt him before you saw him clearly. Vincent Caruso was tall, and the kind of tired that accumulated over years rather than nights. He wore his suit jacket open, his tie loosened, and he moved to his son's bedside with a quietness that she hadn't expected from a man whose public presence was all controlled authority. He stood there looking at Theo for a long moment, his jaw working with something he was not going to say out loud. Then he turned to Lyra. "Who are you?" he asked, not unkindly, simply direct. "Lyra Voss," she said. "Domestic staff. Building services. I know what you are." He looked at her with the focused, evaluating attention of a man who processed people efficiently. "I'm asking who you are." She didn't know to answer that, so she said, "I sat with him because he was crying and no one else was there." Vincent was quiet for a moment. He looked back at his son. "He hasn't slept more than 40 minutes at a stretch in 11 days, he said. "Until 3 nights ago." "You're not a nurse," he said. "No, you have no medical training. No, and yet—" He gestured at the boy, at the monitors showing a heart rate that had steadied at the slack, peaceful face against the pillow. "Yet." He left without another word. But the next morning, Lyra found that her salary had been quietly tripled. Her schedule had been reorganized to evening and overnight hours only, and a small adjacent room off the medical suite had been cleared out and furnished simply. A bed, a lamp, a bookshelf, with the clear implication that it was hers to use. She stayed. The days took on a shape that surprised her. Theo was a serious child, thin-wired and watchful, with the particular intelligence of a kid who had spent too much time listening to adult conversations in hospital waiting rooms. He asked her questions with the careful precision of someone who had been lied to gently many times and had decided to stop accepting gentle lies. He asked her if she thought he was going to die. She told him she didn't know, but that she wasn't going anywhere, and that seemed to satisfy him in a way that more optimistic answers hadn't. She read to him every night. She taught him how to play gin rummy with a battered deck of cards she found in the staff break room. She brought him a small plant from the building's lobby flower display. A succulent she'd talked the florist into surrendering, because he'd mentioned once that he missed being able to see things grow. His numbers began to improve, incrementally, cautiously, in ways that the specialists noted with the particular excitement of people who had expected worse. His immune markers shifted. His appetite returned. Not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, measurably, in the direction of life rather than away from it. Dr. Priya Anand, the lead immunologist flown in from Houston, pulled Lyra aside on the 20th day and said with the slightly affronted expression of a scientist forced to acknowledge something she couldn't quantify, "Whatever you're doing, the consistency, the routine, the reduction in his anxiety levels, is having a physiological effect. Stress hormones were suppressing his immune response. I cannot write this up in a journal, but I am telling you, keep doing exactly what you're doing." Lyra kept doing it. What she did not anticipate was Vincent. He came to the suite every evening. At first, briefly, 20 minutes, sometimes less, clearly carved out of a schedule that had no room for 20 minutes. He would sit beside Theo's bed, speak to him quietly, ask about the card games, about the plant, about whatever book they were currently working through, and then, increasingly, he would linger. Theo would fall asleep, and Vincent would remain in the armchair across the room, a glass of scotch held loosely in one hand, watching the monitors the way a man watches a fire. Not for information, but because looking away felt dangerous. He started talking to Lyra. Not about anything consequential at first. About the book she was reading, about whether Theo had eaten, about the building, the city, small navigational facts exchanged between two people occupying the same space at the same late hour. But the conversations extended, the way conversations do when the night is quiet and two people have more in common than either of them has examined yet. She learned that he had built the first Caruso property at 23, in a neighborhood that had already written itself off, because he believed stubbornly that places could be remade. She told him about Caleb, about the Bronx, about the attorney and the $12,000 and the particular shame of watching someone you love be processed by a system that doesn't know his name. Vincent listened with the complete unhurried attention of a man who had learned that information was the most valuable thing in any room. The next morning, Caleb's public defender called to inform him that a private attorney had appeared on his behalf and that the charges, upon review, were being substantially reduced. Lyra stood in the small adjacent room and breathed very carefully for several minutes. She did not thank Vincent. She didn't know how to thank someone for something that large, without it shifting the ground between them in a direction she wasn't certain about. But that evening, when he came to the suite and found Theo awake and demanding a rematch at gin rummy, and Vincent sat down across the table from his son with the specific, unguarded expression of a man who has forgotten for a moment that he is supposed to be carrying the weight of everything, Lyra thought that maybe the not saying was its own kind of language, and that he understood it. She should have seen what was coming. She had a talent for reading rooms, for noticing the small atmospheric shifts that preceded something significant. She had missed this one, or perhaps had noticed and told herself she was wrong. On the 31st day, she found the medication. She had gone to restock the supply cabinet in the medical annex, a task normally handled by Patricia, who had called in sick. The cabinet was organized with the meticulous precision that clinical environments required, each item labeled and dated, nothing out of place, except for one thing. On the second shelf, behind a row of sealed saline bags, was a small amber vial with no label. Not unusual in itself, sometimes unmarked compounds were part of specialized treatment protocols, but this vial had been placed behind the saline bags, hidden, not stored. Lyra picked it up. She turned it over in her fingers. The liquid inside was faintly viscous, slightly darker than it should have been for anything she recognized as belonging to Theo's current protocol. She put it in her pocket. She wasn't sure why. She put it in her pocket, and she finished restocking the cabinet, and she went back to Theo's room. And she sat in the chair and read to him for an hour, with her heart beating too quickly the entire time. That night, after Theo was asleep, she found Dr. Anand still in the building and told her she'd found something unusual in the supply cabinet and asked if she would look at it. Dr. Anand looked at the vial. Her expression changed. Where exactly did you find this? Behind the saline bags. Hidden. Dr. Anand set the vial down on the counter with very deliberate care, the way you set down something you have suddenly understood, dangerous. This is an immunosuppressant, she said. A synthetic compound. Aggressive. If this had been introduced into his IV line in small doses over time, it would look like his immune system was attacking itself, Lyra said. Dr. Anand looked at her. Yes. The silence in the room was the particular quality of two people arriving at an understanding they would both prefer to be wrong about. He wasn't sick, Lyra said, quietly. He was being made sick. Lyra went to find Marcus. This was, in retrospect, a mistake she could not have known was a mistake. Marcus had been head of security for the Caruso Group for 9 years. He was efficient, professional, and completely trusted. He had also, as Lyra would learn approximately 4 minutes after she walked into his office, already been having a very interesting conversation with his cell phone when she knocked on the door, and the conversation had not been about building security. He heard her out with the composed patience of a man managing a situation. He said he would handle it immediately. He asked her to leave the vial with him so it could be properly analyzed. He asked her, with a particular kindness that she would later understand as practiced, to say nothing to Mr. Caruso until the situation was properly assessed. Lyra handed him the vial and left. She was in the elevator before something wrong settled over her like cold water. She replayed the conversation, the way Marcus had reached for the vial before she'd finished speaking. The way he'd asked her not to tell Vincent before he'd asked her a single question about where she'd found it. She pressed the button for 42. She was halfway down the corridor toward the medical suite when the lights on the floor went out. Not a flicker, not a gradual dimming. Completely out, all at once, the way power goes when something deliberate happens to it rather than something accidental. The emergency lighting clicked on 3 seconds later, bathing the corridor in a flat, institutional amber that made everything look slightly wrong. Lyra did not stop walking. She moved faster. She pushed open the door to the medical suite and crossed immediately to the bed. Theo was awake, sitting up, his eyes wide and frightened in the amber light. She reached him in 4 steps and sat on the edge of the bed and put her arms around him, and he grabbed her uniform with both fists the way children grab things they are afraid of losing. "I've got you," she said. "Stay right here. Don't move." "Lyra, I'm not going anywhere." She could hear footsteps in the corridor. More than one person. The particular cadence of people moving with purpose rather than confusion. Not staff responding to a power outage, but people who had expected the power outage. The door to the suite opened. The woman who walked in was someone Lyra had seen exactly once, in the lobby, 11 days ago. She had noticed her the way you notice expensive things that are assembled very deliberately. The kind of precise, curated elegance that announces itself without saying anything. Her name, Lyra would learn in approximately 2 minutes, was Renata Serrano. She was the chief operating officer of the Caruso Group's international division, which she had joined 4 years ago when she married Vincent's business partner and promptly outlasted the marriage by 18 months. She moved through the Caruso Group like a person who was already measuring the furniture. She was holding a phone, and she was looking at Theo with an expression that Lyra catalogued immediately and completely. Not concern, not affection, not anything that belonged in the presence of a sick child. It was the expression of an accountant reviewing a line item. "Miss Voss," Renata said, with the pleasant tone of someone who has already run the numbers. "This doesn't need to be complicated. Get away from him," Lyra said. Renata tilted her head slightly, as though the response was mildly interesting. "You're a housekeeper who's been here for a month." "I have 11 years of institutional knowledge of this organization, and I have spent 4 of them ensuring that when Vincent is no longer the relevant variable, the transition of the Caruso Group's core assets goes smoothly. Theo is the only obstacle to that transition." She glanced at the boy with the specific detachment of someone discussing an inconvenience. "The vial you found was simply accelerating an inevitable outcome. You've delayed things. That's all." Marcus, Lyra said, has been a practical man for 9 years. Renata smiled with her mouth. It's one of his better qualities. The man who had come in behind Renata was not Marcus. He was large and patient-looking, and stood near the door with the settled quality of someone who was paid to wait. There was a second one that Lyra could not see but could feel. At the window, at the other door, somewhere in the amber-lit edge of the room. Theo had not made a sound. He was pressed against Lyra's side, his breathing shallow, his fists still knotted in her uniform. He was 7 years old, and he had spent enough time in this room to understand the particular texture of a dangerous conversation. Lyra had grown up in a building in the Bronx where, knowing when a situation was about to become physical, was a survival skill you developed early or paid for late. She had developed it early. She knew she could not fight 2 trained men while holding a 7-year-old. She also knew that the medical cart 3 feet to her left contained, among other things, a portable suction unit, a blood pressure monitor on a weighted pole, and a full IV stand with a saline bag and a steel hanging rack. "Theo," she said, her voice perfectly level, "I need you to slide off the bed and get under it right now. Don't argue. Go." Theo, to his tremendous credit, went. The moment he was clear, Lyra threw the IV stand. She didn't throw it at anyone in particular. She threw it at the overhead emergency light panel on the wall behind Renata, and it connected hard enough to explode the fixture, plunging the room into near total darkness broken only by the pale light bleeding in from the city beyond the window. In the 2 seconds of disorientation that followed, Lyra grabbed the weighted blood pressure monitor pole in both hands and put herself in front of the bed. The large man by the door moved toward her. She had been in enough bad situations to know that hesitation was the thing that got you hurt, not confrontation. She swung the pole hard and low, catching him across the knees. He went down with a sound like a piece of furniture being dropped. She was already moving, putting the medical cart between herself and where the second man should be, reaching back with one hand to find the edge of the bed, to find Theo, to make sure. The door to the suite came off its hinges. Not opened, off its hinges. The impact was so total and so sudden that Lyra felt it in her sternum before she processed what she was seeing. In the corridor beyond, the emergency lights caught the shape of several men in dark clothes, moving with the synchronized efficiency of people who had entered buildings under much more difficult circumstances than this. And in the front of all of it, moving through the destroyed doorframe with the unhurried certainty of a man who owns every surface his feet are touching, was Vincent Caruso. He was not wearing his jacket. His sleeves were rolled. In his right hand was a phone, but the way he was holding it made it clear he was done with the phone. His eyes moved through the room in under 3 seconds. The man on the floor. The darkness. Lyra, standing with a weighted pole, her back to the bed. Renata, frozen near the window with the specific expression of someone watching a plan collapse in real time. And then below the bed, 2 small hands gripping the floor and the wide, frightened eyes of his son. Something happened in Vincent Caruso's face that Lyra had not seen there before. It wasn't anger, exactly. Though anger was part of it, it was what lived underneath anger when what has been threatened is the only thing you cannot afford to lose. "Dominic," he said very quietly to the man behind his right shoulder, "secure the room." In 90 seconds it was done. The man Lyra had put down was zip-tied and moved to the corridor. A second security operative materialized from the far side of the suite, hands raised, already talking. Renata stood perfectly still, with her wrists held behind her by a man twice her size, her expensive composure finally completely dissolved. Vincent crossed to the bed. He went down on one knee on the floor and looked underneath it. "Theo," he said, A pause. Then, "Dad, come here!" Theo crawled out from under the bed and into his father's arms, and Vincent held his son with the total consuming focus of a man who has just understood how close he came to a world without him. Lyra set the pole down. Her hands were shaking, which she found mildly irritating. She pressed them flat against her thighs and breathed. After a moment, Vincent stood. He kept one hand on Theo's shoulder. He turned to Lyra, and the look on his face was something she didn't have a word for. Immediately, not gratitude, though had more weight than gratitude. "You found the vial," he said. "Yes. And then Marcus?" "I went to Marcus first. That was a mistake." "Yes." He said it without judgment, as a simple acknowledgement of information. "How did you know to come back?" "He asked me not to tell you before he asked me any other questions." Vincent was quiet for a moment. "Silas," he said, addressing a compact man near the door who had the particular quality of someone who was always listening and never quite where you last positioned him, "I want the full account of what Renata accessed and when. Every financial record, every communication. Tonight?" "Already running," Silas said. Vincent looked back at Lyra. Theo had tucked himself against his father's side, his eyes moving between the two adults with the alert watchfulness of a kid, recalibrating who the important people in a room are. "She put herself in front of me," Theo said. His voice was small and matter-of-fact, which somehow made it heavier than drama would have. "When it got dark, she put herself in front of me." Vincent's jaw worked very briefly. He looked at Lyra with an expression that had entirely stopped performing anything. "I know," he said. The debrief took the rest of the night. Renata was held in the building's lower-level security suite, which Lyra gathered was a room that had been used for exactly this purpose before and would likely be used again. Marcus was found attempting to leave the building through the service entrance and was collected with minimal ceremony. Dr. Anand, reached by phone, confirmed that the compound in the vial, a synthetic immunosuppressant that had no business being in a pediatric patient supply cabinet, was consistent with the pattern of Theo's deterioration over the past 2 months. 2 months. He had not been failing to respond to treatment. He had been methodically poisoned by the people responsible for his care, with the practiced patience of someone who had decided that his existence was inconvenient and had set a timeline accordingly. Renata had spent 4 years positioning herself to inherit the operational core of the Caruso Group in the event of a leadership transition. Vincent's business partner, her former husband, had died 18 months ago, leaving his shares in a trust structured to revert to Renata upon his death, and to consolidate further if Theo predeceased Vincent without a restructured will. She had moved quietly, strategically, with the particular long-game patience of someone who understood that the most effective attacks are the ones that look like natural causes. She had not counted on a housekeeper who couldn't sleep working a night shift on a floor she wasn't supposed to be on. Dawn came in through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 42nd floor with the flat, silver indifference of November in New York City. Lyra stood at the window of the small adjacent room and watched the city begin to move below, and felt very clearly the specific exhaustion of a body that has been running on adrenaline for 6 hours and has now run out. She heard the door open behind her. Vincent came in and stood beside her at the window. He was holding 2 cups of coffee, and he handed her one without asking whether she wanted it. She wrapped her hands around the warmth of it. "He's asleep," Vincent said. "Real sleep good." Dr. Anand believes that if we suspend all current treatment protocols and allow his immune system to function without interference, his recovery may be considerably faster than we projected. "Yes," Lyra said. "I imagine it might be." Vincent was quiet for a moment, looking out at the city. He had the quality, in the early morning, of a man who was no longer managing anything, not his expression, not his posture, not the weight of what the night had cost him. He simply stood there, which was, she thought, a thing he probably very rarely allowed himself. "My attorneys will be contacting the firm handling your brother's case this morning," he said. "The remaining charges will be addressed." Lyra looked down at the coffee. "You already did something. I moved the first piece. This will close it." She didn't say anything for a moment, then, "Why?" He turned to look at her. "Why did I help him? Or why am I telling you now instead of letting you find out the way you found out the first time?" "Either. Both. Because your brother was in the wrong place for the wrong reasons and the system was going to punish him at full volume for it, and I had the ability to intervene." He paused. "And because you were the first person in this building who sat with my son in the dark, simply because he was crying, without being asked, without anything in it for you." Lyra thought about Caleb's voice on the phone the last time she'd called, the particular carefully managed flatness of a teenager trying not to sound scared and failing at it. She thought about Theo's hands gripping her uniform in the dark. "He reminded me of my brother," she said, "when he was little, before everything got complicated. Vincent nodded slowly, as though this was the kind of answer he'd thought it might be. The position of full-time care coordinator for Theo's recovery is yours, Ed. If you want it. Real title, real salary, full benefits. You would report to Dr. Anand on medical matters and to no one else on anything regarding Theo. He looked at her steadily. You don't owe me an answer. You don't owe me an answer. This is an offer, not a requirement. Lyra looked out at the city. Somewhere downtown, Caleb was sleeping in a facility that she was going to be able to get him out of. Somewhere down the hall, a 7-year-old boy was sleeping without fear for the first time in weeks, with a small succulent on his windowsill and a battered deck of cards on his bedside table. She thought about the $240 in her checking account, and the diner that smelled like burnt coffee, and the apartment she'd been 2 months from losing. She thought about what it felt like to sit in the dark with someone who was frightened and simply be present without an agenda, without a performance, and have that matter more than anything else in the room. Yes, she said. Vincent's expression shifted barely, a slight easing around the eyes that she was learning to read as the equivalent, in his particular emotional register, of considerable feeling. Good, he said. They stood there for a moment longer, side by side at the window, both holding their coffee, watching the city arrive at another ordinary morning that was completely ordinary for everyone in it except them. Inside the suite down the hall, Theo Caruso slept deeply and well, his heart monitor beeping at a steady, strong, unhurried 84 beats per minute. On his windowsill, in the first pale light of morning, the small succulent cast a thin, clean shadow against the glass. On his bedside table, the battered deck of cards waited for a rematch. He was going to be fine.